In all history, it has been said, nothing has succeeded like America and the promise of America. One nation, not based upon natural geographic barriers or common religion or ethnic heritage. One nation, the first to make the inalienable rights of man the foundation of its national identity. A government created to secure those rights, to preserve the fundamental ideals of liberty, equality, and justice.
I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute.
Over the course of 200 years, the government and presidency have evolved and survived.
To the best of my ability.
As men, some have been strong and decisive, some ambitious and opportunistic, some were weak, passive, now almost forgotten. Some have been remarkable statesmen. But each, in the words of historian Bruce Catton, was acting for something much bigger than personal ambition. He was acting for the presidency. They came from diverse backgrounds, yet most had some sort of experience in public office, and more than half have practiced law sometime during their lives. Working methods and lifestyles have changed markedly. Through 2 centuries, the most significant change in the presidency has been its growth of power. As the highest political office in the land, it is the linchpin of the entire American political system. The presidency, an American success story.
So help me God.
So help me God.
So help me God.
I do solemnly swear.
April 30th, 1789. At the age of 57, George Washington takes the oath of office to become the first president of the United States of America. He represented unity. He represented the entire nation. The selection of George Washington was a natural one. Early on, Washington displayed leadership qualities. In 1755, when British General Braddock was killed during the French and Indian War, Washington led the survivors to safety. Years later, Washington was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. On October 19, 1781, Lord Cornwallis's troops finally surrendered to Washington at Yorktown, Virginia. The war was effectively over. 4 years later, Washington was once again called to serve his country. The Articles of Confederation were not working. And so when Washington arrived in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention, he was elected chairman and used his influence to help create a strong federal government. The new nation needed a president. There was only one logical choice. There was no campaign for Washington. He was elected unanimously by representatives of the states. He received word of his election at his beloved Mount Vernon home and began an 8-day triumphal ride to his inauguration, passing under lavish arches in grand style. The honor and dignity of the office was set by Washington. But within his cabinet, there was conflict, disputes over the unending question about the power of government. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton hotly advocated a strong central government. Secretary of State Jefferson took the opposite side. He wanted power spread among the states. As a mediator, Washington was masterful, keeping both Jefferson and Hamilton together in the cabinet. And though his power was increasing, he respected the Constitution. The first term of Washington was an era of firsts. the president signed a bill creating the United States Bank. The New York Stock Exchange was established. The cotton gin was invented in 1793. It mechanized the production of cotton, which drove the Southern economy. With tension in his own cabinet and Europe in turmoil, Washington agreed to serve a second term as president. In 1794 came the most serious test of the federal government's ability to enforce laws. Farmers in western Pennsylvania and throughout Appalachia rebelled, refusing to pay an excise tax on whiskey. It was known as the Whiskey Rebellion. After 2 firm warnings, Washington used force to disperse the angry farmers. By the end of his second term, Washington was ready to retire. Mount Vernon had been ignored during his years in government. He returned there to live out his years as a gentleman farmer. On a rainy December day, Washington fell ill after riding the fields. There was no remedy. He died on December 14th, 1799. The first presidential campaign, the nation's first real election battle, was in 1796. Adams, the Federalist, was opposed by Thomas Jefferson, the Republican. John Adams won the election. But Adams took office in an atmosphere of discord. The XYZ affair caused a crisis of hysteria at home. It all started when a 3-man American Peace Commission went to France and was subjected to a bribe. President Adams was outraged and began to prepare for war. Vice President Thomas Jefferson charged Adams with inventing an excuse for war. Hysteria over XYZ continued to grow, and in 1798, an undeclared naval war began, the first undeclared presidential war. And though it never became a full-blown war, Adams was hailed a national hero for his strong actions. It was in the highly charged climate following the XYZ affair that Adams was able to push and pass the Alien and Sedition Acts. It made scandalous and malicious writings against the government illegal, indisputably a way for Adams to silence the Republican opposition. It also reflected Adams' idea that foreigners should not have a right to come into the country and denounce incumbent presidents or interfere in American politics. The rest of his term was filled with internal disputes and problems. And in the election of 1800, he was defeated by his political foe, Thomas Jefferson. For Adams, it was a major blow. John Adams died on July 4th, 1826, Independence Day, and the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. In 1796, he ran for president against Adams and lost, and ended up vice president of the United States at the age of 53. 4 years later, Jefferson won the presidency, and later called the victory the Revolution of 1800. It represented a change of government and party in power through the electoral process. In 1802, Napoleon was attempting to re-establish a major French presence on the North American continent, and it had Americans worried. Jefferson was determined to stop French interference and protect American trade on the Mississippi. At the same time, Napoleon needed money for a war he intended to wage against Britain. Remarkably, he decided to sell all of the Louisiana Territory for $15 million. One of the most significant events during Jefferson's first term was a Supreme Court decision, Marbury versus Madison. This case established the Supreme Court's power of judicial review to declare acts of Congress unconstitutional. On July 4th, 1826, on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson died at Monticello. Jefferson wrote his own epitaph. It listed what he considered his three greatest accomplishments. They were author of the Declaration of Independence, creator of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, founder of the University of Virginia. Jefferson did not want to be remembered simply for his presidency, rather as the man he was, a man whose life was dedicated to human liberty and justice. The year was 1809, and James Madison took the oath of office to become the fourth president of the United States. Madison's wife, Dolly, was to become a first lady of style and grace, known for her lavish entertaining. At the beginning of his term, the continued harassment of American trading ships was rapidly evolving into the major issue of the day. Britain and France refused to respect neutrality of the American fleet. In 1811, France yielded to pressure and released all captured American ships. The following year, war was declared against Britain, the War of 1812. America was unprepared to fight. Eventually, both war-weary sides negotiated the Treaty of Ghent in 1814, ending the war the following year. The war had ended American economic dependence on Britain. The nation could focus now on growth. In the Pacific Northwest, the first permanent settlement was started by John Jacob Astor's fur business, and the first steamboat was traveling the great Mississippi River. It was a time of peace and prosperity. By the end of Madison's second term, he was a popular figure. He retired from public life. But there were also family problems. His son was a gambler and an alcoholic, paying off more than $40,000 of his son's gambling losses. The retired president, the father of the Constitution, and author of the Bill of Rights, would end up a man in debt. He died in 1836 at 85, the last of the founding fathers. In 1816, Monroe won the presidency, the last Revolutionary War officer to ascend to the nation's highest office. He traveled widely. Monroe supported the westward pioneers and acquired vast western lands, including parts of the Oregon Territory. During this period, American Indians would pay a heavy price as they were displaced from their land. By 1819, depression had set in. It was the worst in the nation's short history. It lasted for 2 years, and antagonism between North and South over the dark issue of slavery made it a time of growing division. The era of good feeling was ending in sectionalism, but troubles were brewing. The young United States felt threatened by the great imperial powers, namely Spain and Russia. In the far west, Russia had established fur trading posts along the Pacific in the Oregon Territory, and the European powers were trying to establish footholds in Latin America. In 1823, Monroe put his foot down. While at his Oak Hill estate near Leesburg, Virginia, he wrote what was to become one of the cornerstones of American foreign policy, the Monroe Doctrine. It declared to the world that the American continent was no longer open to European colonization. Like other presidents before him, Monroe found himself in dire financial straits when he left the White House. Forced to sell his beloved Virginia home, Monroe spent his last years with his daughter and in-laws in New York City. He died on July 4th, 1831, the third of the first 5 presidents to die on Independence Day. In 1824, John Quincy began his bid for the presidency in a bitterly fought campaign against Andrew Jackson. The following year, at the age of 57, John Quincy Adams became the 6th president of the United States. In a 4-way race, no candidate won a majority of electoral votes, and the House of Representatives elected Adams. The presidency should have been the crowning success of his career. It proved less than fulfilling. His brilliance as a diplomat, his strong principles, his high standards and independence didn't carry over well into the White House. In his re-election bid for president, John Quincy Adams lost in a landslide vote to his old rival, Andrew Jackson. Adams returned to Massachusetts a defeated man. But 2 years later, after leaving the presidency, John Quincy was elected by a write-in vote to serve his Massachusetts district in the House of Representatives. He didn't seek out the opportunity, but Adams became the only American president to serve in the House after his presidency. As a member of the House for 18 more years, John Quincy attacked slavery on moral grounds. This, he believed, was one of his greatest accomplishments. Like his father, he was quick to assert his own abhorrence to slavery. Adams died in the House of Representatives in 1848, a man of diversity and dedication. He was the last president of the Virginia and Massachusetts dynasties, the last with ties to the founding fathers. In 1828, Jackson, under the banner of the Democratic Party, won the presidency after a bitter campaign against President John Quincy Adams. Both sides engaged in personal attacks. Jackson was portrayed as a gambler and murderer who married a bigamist. On Inauguration Day, thousands of Jackson admirers overwhelmed the Capitol and ransacked the president's house. Jackson's foes were horrified. His supporters said the common man had found a voice in the nation's most powerful office. As president, Jackson demanded personal loyalty. He assembled a kitchen cabinet, an intimate group of personal advisors, and he greatly increased the spoils system, offering government jobs to his political supporters. Jackson's administration presided over the violent removal of thousands of Indians to unsettled land west of the Mississippi. The forced exodus of Cherokee Indians from their ancestral home would be recorded in history as the Trail of Tears. Jackson's 2 terms can be seen as a great paradox. He was firmly committed to laissez-faire government and used the veto more than all of his predecessors combined. But his actions actually served to greatly increase the strength of the presidency. Jackson completed his 2nd term and retired to his Tennessee estate, the Hermitage. And while he had embittered many in politics, his popularity with the common man was undiminished. His place in history as a towering figure of the young American nation was secure. When Martin Van Buren reached the Capitol building for his inauguration in 1837, a crowd of 20,000 cheered. But there could be no doubt that the object of the crowd's affection was Van Buren's escort, Old Hickory, the outgoing president, Andrew Jackson. Senator Thomas Hart Benton said it was the only time the rising sun was eclipsed by the setting sun. At age 54, the man known as OK for Old Kinderhook became the 8th President of the United States. But all was not okay in the spring of 1837. In his inaugural address, Van Buren warned that slavery was becoming a source of discord and disaster, threatening national unity. And Andrew Jackson's economic policies had led to financial panic. The nation was heading into the worst economic depression in its history. A firm believer in the Jeffersonian principle of limited government, President Van Buren did little while thousands suffered. A man of refined taste, Van Buren was famous for his elegant lifestyle. With the economy still hurting, resentment toward the president grew, and his re-election bid was doomed. He was a man who built his reputation as a cautious political insider, the great compromiser. But in his final years, he took a spirited and principled stand against slavery. In 1862, the nation was at war against itself. And Martin Van Buren, 8th President of the United States, died peacefully in his bed, a portrait of Andrew Jackson above his head. With the nation's economy struggling, the aristocratic Martin Van Buren became an easy target in the 1840 presidential campaign. William Henry Harrison, the Whig standard-bearer, campaigned as a friend of the poor. Born in a log cabin, the military hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe. In the 1840 campaign, Whig Party strategists focused on style and public relations, not substance. No party platform was drafted. The crafting of a false image of Harrison and relentless attacks on Van Buren brought handsome returns. William Henry Harrison was elected 9th President of the United States. After his election, Harrison returned from the West to his ancestral home. Writing at this desk at Berkeley Plantation, he drafted his inaugural address, the longest ever. The 68-year-old Harrison, without hat or topcoat, delivered the speech on a wintry day in Washington. It took him almost 2 hours to complete. He developed pneumonia and died only 30 days later. His grand hopes for the presidency reduced to these footnotes in history. He served the shortest term, and he was the first president to die in office. When Vice President John Tyler was notified of William Henry Harrison's death, the issue of who would take charge of the executive office was far from clear. Tyler moved into the White House, firmly staked his claim to the presidency, and asserted full constitutional authority. It was the first and probably most important act of his administration, but it was to be a bumpy ride. Time after time, Tyler vetoed Whig Party legislation. Cabinet members resigned in protest. Senator Henry Clay and the Whigs were furious and drew up articles of impeachment. Impeachment lacked support. The stalemate continued. Spurned by both parties, Tyler retired to Virginia. He considered himself a political outlaw, and Riley named his estate Sherwood Forest. He enjoyed a quiet retirement, but joined the political fray one last time as the Civil War began. Tyler rejected the Union he had served as president and won election to the Confederate House of Representatives. He died before taking his seat, but his final actions cemented his legacy as one of America's most controversial presidents. In May 1844, a deadlocked Democratic convention turned to the first dark horse candidate in history, James K. Polk of Tennessee. The Whig Party rejoiced. United behind Henry Clay, their derisive campaign slogan became, "Who is James K. Polk?" On Inauguration Day, the Democrats had this reply: "James K. Polk is the 11th President of the United States." As candidate and president, Polk reflected the public's desire to expand the nation's borders and dominate the continent. It was called America's Manifest Destiny. The United States and Mexico both claimed possession of a portion of Texas. The dispute was settled by the bloody Mexican War, ending in an American victory. Mexico relinquished its claim on Texas and ceded the huge California territory. The treaty after the war gave the United States 500,000 square miles of new land. The nation's borders now extended to the Pacific. Polk had accomplished his final goal, but critics were quick to note that his agenda failed to address the growing social discord caused by industrialization and immigration. And the nation still seemed hopelessly divided on the issue of slavery. Polk had thrown himself into the presidency as perhaps no one else to that time. He became consumed with every detail of his administration. It took a heavy toll. James Polk died at the age of 53, just 3 months after leaving the White House. Throughout history, Americans have sought out military leaders to serve as president. And no matter how they rank as presidents, the military hero always has a secure place in the American pantheon. Such a man was Zachary Taylor, 12th President of the United States. Taylor won a close election and became the only president in history who had been a soldier and nothing but a soldier. Slavery, ignored during the campaign, confronted Taylor head-on as he took office. The controversy over extending slavery to newly acquired territory was bitter and growing ever more tense. Though a slaveholder himself, Taylor took a principled stand. He insisted that California enter the Union as a free state. Congressional leaders, led by the respected Henry Clay, sought compromise. Months of debate followed. Some consider it among the greatest and most impassioned debates in our government's history. President Taylor held firm. He rejected all compromise plans, but he would not live to see the end of the debate. On the 4th of July, 1850, Taylor attended ceremonies as the cornerstone was laid at the Washington Monument. It was a blistering, hot day. The 65-year-old president took ill and never recovered. 5 days later, he was dead, just 16 months into his term. The death of Zachary Taylor was sudden and stunning, and it elevated the most obscure figure yet to serve in the nation's highest office, Millard Fillmore of Western New York State. The Whig Party nominated Southerner Zachary Taylor in 1848. To balance the ticket, Fillmore was named as his running mate. When President Taylor died, the rancor over slavery, and to some, the fate of the Union, fell to Millard Fillmore. Fillmore put the full weight of the presidency behind compromise on slavery. He saw compromise as the only alternative to war. The Compromise of 1850 was achieved. It admitted California as a free state, allowed other territories to decide the slavery question for themselves, and established a rigid fugitive slave law. The compromise pleased virtually no one. Above all else, the fugitive slave law enraged anti-slavery Northerners. It called for the return of runaway slaves to their owners. Fillmore's support of compromise on slavery sealed his political fate, and he was denied the nomination in 1852. Though retired from politics, he still spoke out against many Lincoln administration policies during the Civil War. Branded a bigot and traitor by his critics, Fillmore lived out his remaining years in Buffalo, and there he died on March 8, 1874. In 1852, a deadlocked Democratic convention nominated the little-known Pierce for president on the 49th ballot. The spread of slavery remained the most contentious issue of expansion. Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas proposed a bill. It would carve 2 new territories out of Indian lands west of the Missouri River. Leaving questions of slavery to settlers, it was called popular sovereignty. President Pierce approved and signed into law the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Few laws in American history have had such a profound and devastating impact. Pro- and anti-slavery factions flooded Kansas seeking control. Positions hardened. Violence was at hand. But not limited to Kansas. After delivering an anti-slavery speech, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts was beaten senseless on the floor of the United States Senate. Hopes for a peaceful resolution of slavery were nearly gone. Pierce's stand on slavery ruined his chances for a second term and tainted his place in history. In retirement, he reaffirmed his allegiance with Southern slaveholders and harshly criticized Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. Widowed, forlorn, increasingly unpopular, he turned to drink and died on October 8, 1869, in Concord, New Hampshire. The furor over the Kansas-Nebraska Act and resentment directed at a wave of immigrants entering the nation led to political upheaval. The two-party system collapsed. The anti-slavery Republican Party was born. Democrat James Buchanan, serving overseas, had taken no public position on the Kansas crisis and so was nominated for president in 1856. Many hoped Buchanan, a man of vast government experience, would save the day. In his inaugural address, Buchanan argued that slavery was legal and beyond the reach of the federal government. Edwin Stanton of Ohio warned him, "You are sleeping on a volcano." The Supreme Court bolstered Buchanan's view in the Dred Scott decision when it affirmed the constitutionality of slavery and ruled that slaves were property, not citizens. Bleeding Kansas was the main battleground, virtually a rehearsal for the Civil War. Scores died. Some newspapers said a state of war existed. In 1859, abolitionist John Brown led a raid against a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Brown was convicted and hanged. Passions were aroused. The case crystallized sentiments on both sides. The Union was crumbling, and Buchanan would become a one-term president. Buchanan took office hoping to quiet the storm over slavery. In his final days in the White House, he said, "I am the last president of the United States." A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. With these words, Abraham Lincoln began his Senate campaign in 1858 and took the first steps of a crusade to save the Union, and some say democracy itself, which Lincoln defined as the last best hope of earth. Lincoln's increased stature, along with his reputation as a moderate on slavery, earned him the Republican nomination for president in 1860. With the Democratic Party fractured and 4 candidates running, Lincoln won the election. Southerners regarded Lincoln's victory as the final blow. December 20th, 1860, South Carolina declared the Union dissolved. Secession had begun. President Lincoln had been cautious on the issue of slavery. After Antietam, the president sensed the time was right and issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Since it freed slaves only in the Confederacy, it could not be enforced, but it transformed the nature of the war. It was now a struggle against slavery. Lincoln said, "If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act." Then in July 1863, the turning point, 2 huge armies converged on the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. 88,000 Northern soldiers faced off against 75,000 Southerners. It was the most important moment of the war, the greatest battle ever fought on American soil. On April 9th, 1865, Lee surrendered. The war was over. More than 600,000 on both sides were dead. The Union had been saved. Less than a week after the surrender, Lincoln and his wife attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. During the performance, an actor named John Wilkes Booth entered the theater. He stood behind Lincoln's rocking chair and shot the president. Through the night, his family and political leaders held a vigil. When he died the next morning, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton broke the silence. Now he belongs to the ages. Blunt and fiercely independent, Andrew Johnson of Tennessee was both a Southern Democrat and a staunch Union man, and so was chosen to balance the ticket in President Lincoln's re-election bid. Ill and braced by alcohol, Johnson's inaugural speech as vice president was slurred and rambling. Tongues wagged. A New York newspaper called Johnson a clown and said, "May God bless and spare Abraham Lincoln." Only 6 weeks later, Johnson became the 17th president. With veto-proof majorities in Congress, Republicans pushed through civil rights legislation. Then Congress passed a bill requiring Senate approval before the president could fire cabinet members. Ignoring the bill, Johnson fired Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Stanton would not be removed, literally. He locked himself in his office. The crisis came to a head. The House impeached Johnson, but the Senate came one vote short of removing him from office. While Johnson was embroiled in controversy, his Secretary of State, William Seward, was able to negotiate the purchase of Alaska from Russia. Called Seward's folly at the time, it was truly a bargain at $7 million. Johnson left the White House, but was not through with politics. He was elected to the Senate and made an emotional return to the site of his bitter impeachment trial. He was the only president to be impeached and the only man to serve in the Senate following his presidency. When President Lincoln called for volunteers at the beginning of the Civil War, Ulysses Grant, a 39-year-old clerk in a leather goods store, offered his services. A most unlikely choice to be the hero of the war. Grant's troops swept through Confederate strongholds in the West. He was appointed commander of all Union armies. He spent a year grinding down the armies in Northern Virginia. Grant against Lee, with horrendous casualties. After Lee's surrender and the troubled presidency of Andrew Johnson, the White House was Grant's for the asking. He won a resounding victory and took office amid high expectations. As president, Grant tried to ease tensions between North and South. But corruption engulfed his administration, and events began to spin out of control. Though his integrity was not questioned, growing revelations of corruption and a financial panic which led to a depression tainted his presidency. Before leaving office, Grant apologized to the nation. He said his mistakes were errors of judgment, but not intent. Almost 20 years later, penniless and battling cancer, the ex-president struggled to complete his memoirs to earn money for his family. He finished on July 16, 1885, just 1 week before his death. For over 10 years, confidence in America's highest political office had been shaken. Assassination, impeachment, corruption. Then, with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876, the electoral process itself would be scandalized in the most disputed election in American history. A congressional commission was appointed to decide the outcome. As president, Hayes withdrew federal forces that had occupied the South. It was the formal end of Reconstruction. The era of Jim Crow and segregation had begun. A man of probity, Hayes tried to set a moral tone for the nation. His wife, Lucy, was a temperance supporter who would not serve liquor in the White House. The lure of success in America was attracting people the world over. By the end of Hayes' term, massive immigration from Europe, and to a much lesser degree from China, would push America's population to 50 million. The immigrants represented diverse cultures and were used as a cheap source of labor. Troubling new issues were emerging: urban squalor, prejudice, workers' rights. When his term ended, Hayes retired to his Spiegel Grove home in Fremont, Ohio. While on a trip, Hayes became gravely ill, but insisted on returning to Fremont. He said, "I would rather die at Spiegel Grove than live anywhere else." 3 days later, he was dead. 1880 election was one of the narrowest presidential contests in history. Almost 9 million ballots were cast, and the winner was James Garfield, with a margin of less than 7,000. At the 1880 Republican Convention, after 35 ballots, Garfield emerged as his party's compromise candidate. He squeaked into office in the general election. With no mandate, Garfield fretted about his term ahead. A struggle in his own party over presidential appointments consumed his attention. And then, just 4 months into his administration, Garfield was shot by Charles Guiteau, a deranged man who had been denied a government job. Garfield was gravely injured. Surgeons could not find the bullet. Alexander Graham Bell also failed to find it with an electrical device of his own design. The invention of the X-ray was still 14 years away. Garfield's wife Lucretia won lasting admiration as she kept a vigil for 80 days. On September 19th, 1881, James Garfield died, the 4th president to die in office, the 2nd to be assassinated. In the days after President Garfield was shot, nervous attention was focused on Vice President Chester Arthur. To the public, he was a symbol of the spoils system that had corrupted American politics. And so the great spoilsman himself became a reformer. Signed into law the Pendleton Act, the first reform of the civil service, establishing a system of merit selection for government employees, and vetoed legislation he felt would lead to waste. Arthur maintained a rigorous schedule despite a serious kidney ailment. He toured Yellowstone Park and enjoyed frequent fishing trips. As president, Arthur exceeded almost everyone's expectations. Having broken with the political bosses in his own party and in failing health, Arthur did not seek a second term. Republicans, the party of Lincoln and the Union, had dominated American politics since the Civil War. The 1884 election restored the two-party system to national government by sending a Democrat to the White House for the first time in 28 years. Grover Cleveland, a minister's son from New Jersey, became a political reformer. In his inaugural address, Cleveland promised reform, but other issues demanded his attention. Industrial expansion and immigration had created vexing social problems. Immigrants were targets of ethnic violence. Life in urban ghettos shattered the dreams of many of America's newest citizens. But those dreams still existed, and America remained a magnet for people the world over. In October of 1886, a new symbol of the American dream was set in place as President Cleveland unveiled the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. The appalling conditions of industrial workers had given rise to a growing labor movement. Disputes often became violent. Cleveland was perplexed by the labor problem, but still moved ahead with his reform program, establishing the Interstate Commerce Commission. Cleveland's economic policies would prove his political undoing. He was unseated by Republican Benjamin Harrison. The only president to marry in the White House, Cleveland took his 22-year-old ward, Frances Folsom, as his bride. As the Clevelands prepared to leave the White House in 1889, the popular First Lady told the staff to take care of the home. She said she and the president would be returning in 4 years' time. On March 4th, 1841, William Henry Harrison was sworn in as our 9th president. On March 4th, 1889, Benjamin Harrison was sworn in as the 23rd president, the only grandson of a president to become a president. The quirks of the Electoral College made Harrison the third man to win the presidency despite receiving fewer votes than his opponent. A champion of veterans, Harrison heartily approved generous pensions for Civil War soldiers and dependents. By midterm, federal spending was approaching $1 billion. Critics cried foul. Two controversial policies during Harrison's term would later be blamed for a devastating financial panic. The Silver Purchase Act and the record-setting McKinley tariff of almost 50% on foreign goods led to high inflation and a run on gold reserves. Harrison shaped a vigorous, activist foreign policy, projecting American power abroad and starting a program to build a two-ocean navy. Economic problems made Harrison vulnerable, and he lost his re-election bid. Defeated, recently widowed, Harrison returned to Indianapolis. He remarried late in life and won renewed respect as a senior statesman. He died at home on March 13, 1901, and was honored with a state funeral. When Grover Cleveland defeated Benjamin Harrison in 1892, he became the only president to win non-consecutive terms. In the last decade of the century, despite unprecedented industrial growth, most Americans still found work down on the farm. The 1890 census showed farm workers outnumbered job holders in all other industries combined. Statistics also showed it was an uneducated workforce. Only 1 in 400 Americans earned a college degree. In the 1890s, workers faced an uncertain future. As Cleveland took office for the second time, he was confronted with the worst economic crisis in the nation's history. 15,000 businesses would fail. Millions lost their jobs. Many went hungry. In Chicago, President Cleveland sent federal troops to disperse masses of unemployed and striking rail workers led by Eugene Debs. The ensuing chaos was some of the worst domestic violence since the Civil War. Cleveland left the White House with his popularity at a low ebb. He had been called Grover the Good, but now was deeply hurt that he had lost the confidence of the American people. He retired to Princeton, New Jersey. Over time, his reputation was restored. He died on June 24, 1908. His last words were, "I have tried so hard to do right." It was an era that would be remembered as the gay 90s. But in 1896, the country was reeling from the worst economic calamity in its history, and the Republican Party was returned to power with the election of William McKinley. When McKinley took office, a revolt against Spanish rule was already underway in Cuba. Many Americans, excited by the prospect of a foreign conquest, wanted to join the fight. McKinley tried to maintain neutrality. But when the U.S. battleship Maine blew up in Havana Harbor, Americans demanded action. McKinley yielded, war was declared, and U.S. troops routed the Spanish in Cuba. Spain agreed to Cuban independence and handed over Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines to the United States. America was becoming a global power. With a sound economy and Spanish-American war hero Theodore Roosevelt sharing the ticket, McKinley ran for re-election. He won a sweeping victory. In September 1901, President McKinley attended the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, a spectacular display of technology for the new century. While greeting guests in a reception line, the president was shot. 8 days later, he died. The third president since the Civil War to be assassinated. At the age of 42, Vice President Theodore Roosevelt was sworn in. He was young and energetic. The youngest president in the history of the nation, soon to be the most popular since Abraham Lincoln. Roosevelt gained a national reputation as a hero in the Spanish-American War. Later, he became governor of New York, attacking corruption vigorously. And in 1900, he accepted the vice presidential nomination under McKinley, with his eyes set on becoming president 4 years later. Yet fate had a quicker timetable. With tremendous momentum, America was becoming industrial and urban. With machines and mass production came great inequality, a growing need for social justice and reform. Roosevelt wasted no time initiating a sweeping reform movement against what he called the tyranny of plutocracy. Roosevelt set aside millions of acres of land as national parks, earning the name the Great Conservationist. He was becoming a legend, and in 1904 was elected in his own right. Determined to show the world America's military might, he sent Marines to Panama and pushed for building the Panama Canal. Declaring America had come of age, Roosevelt sent American warships, the Great White Fleet, painted white for peace, around the world. But Roosevelt chose not to run for a third term, though he would be back. He remains one of the most popular presidents of all time, and it was he who in many ways shaped the modern presidency. William Howard Taft was Roosevelt's hand-picked successor. As he campaigned for the presidency in 1908, Taft was affable, likable, electable.
Get on the raft with Taft, boys, get in the winning boat. The man worthwhile with a big glad smile will get the honest vote.
In 1909, Taft became president and continued Roosevelt's crusade to make government more efficient and to break up big business monopolies. Yet Taft had his own style and failings. Increasingly, his presidency became troubled. Progressive elements in his party were at odds with him. Soon after the popular TR returned from a trip to Africa in 1910, a personal and political struggle developed between old friends Taft and Roosevelt. The result was a split of the Republican Party. When Roosevelt failed to win the Republican nomination, he formed a third party, the Progressive Party, nicknamed the Bull Moose Party. It was a bitter campaign. The split proved fatal to the Republicans. But in the end, the Taft administration failed on its own. After leaving the White House, Taft became the only president to serve on the Supreme Court. He was appointed Chief Justice. It was an office he had long sought and brought a respectable end to a long government career.
Wilson, that's all. Wilson.
Woodrow Wilson, the first Democratic president of the 20th century.
Who will be our president? It's Wilson, that's all.
A striking contrast to the outgoing Taft. Wilson was an intellectual who arrived in Washington with a great understanding of presidential power. By 1914, war had broken out in Europe, and Wilson vowed America would remain neutral. On May 7th, 1915, the British liner Lusitania was sunk by a German submarine, killing 1,200 civilians, including 128 Americans. Wilson wanted peace, talked of peace, but began preparing for war. Wilson the pacifist plunged America into war to make the world safe for democracy. In January 1918, Wilson sailed to Europe with his 14-point peace plan for a new world order. The 1919 Treaty of Versailles placed full blame for the war on Germany. To promote world peace, Wilson pushed for the creation of a League of Nations. He believed that the United States had secured its rightful place as a leader in world affairs. But Congress rejected the treaty, and the United States never joined the League. Throughout this period, Wilson's health was deteriorating. By the time he left the White House, he was an invalid. And though the defeat of the League of Nations was a major blow, the birth of the United Nations after the Second World War bears Wilson's stamp. With his moral conviction and his great idealism, Woodrow Wilson has left a powerful legacy. In 1920, Republican Warren G. Harding promised a return to normalcy in the post-war years and won in a landslide victory. As president, he cut government spending and helped save government money by introducing business-like principles to his administration. He was popular, relaxed, a president who ran the ship of state loosely. Increasingly, his cabinet began to run the presidency. He was a worried man, worried not, he said, about his enemies, but his friends. And he was fatigued, demoralized. At the end of a 4-week political trip, Harding fell ill and died. While the nation was still mourning the president, investigations were underway that would destroy his reputation. America would later learn the cabinet was racked by corruption. Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, would become the first cabinet member in history sentenced to prison in what became known as the Teapot Dome Scandal, a conspiracy to illegally sell government oil reserves. In the end, the nation learned there were few in the Harding administration at the top level who were not corrupt. History would not be kind to Harding. Harding was succeeded by Vice President Calvin Coolidge, a man of little influence on the political scene. Many considered him uninvolved, and that is how he liked it. His laissez-faire policy was popular. Coolidge said, "The business of America is business."
So just keep cool and keep Coolidge in the White House 4 years more.
It helped him win the 1924 election.
In this year of 24, he's been tried, he's never...
The economy was humming. Henry Ford's production line allowed the cost of a Model T to drop to $265. They were popular, even though some found them a bit tricky to handle. It was the Jazz Age, the Roaring Twenties, speakeasies, the Charleston, and flappers. Yet there were persistent domestic problems, hatred and crime. KKK membership would surpass 4 million, and prohibition, which banned alcohol, brought violence. But the nation was captivated by the heroes of the day. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh, or Lucky Lindy as he became known, was the first to fly solo across the Atlantic. And Babe Ruth set a record for home runs and became baseball's most colorful and popular figure. The stock market was booming. President Coolidge said there was no need to fear economic growth. A popular message, but one that masked the nation's underlying problems. America was on a giddy ride, but within months of Coolidge's departure, the nation was in for a devastating fall, the likes of which had never been seen. In 1928, the Republicans promised a chicken in every pot and 2 cars in every garage.
Let us be loyal to the man who'll treat us loyal, our president so grand.
Hoover won the presidency.
For he'll always serve us with a watch.
But America's prosperity had been built on a house of cards. Less than a year into Hoover's term, the stock market crashed. The Great Depression had begun. At home, there were unemployment lines, bread lines. Homeless families lived in shanty towns called Hoovervilles. Hobos rode the rails. A nation that had been brimming with confidence was now crippled. Destitute World War I veterans marched on Washington, demanding early payment of bonuses. The bonus army built makeshift camps and occupied abandoned buildings. Hoover sent in troops under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. With bayonets fixed, backed by tanks and tear gas, troopers drove the veterans from the Capitol and destroyed their camps. Month after month, the Depression deepened. To a desperate nation, Hoover seemed incapable of solving the crisis. He had been elected in a landslide, and in 1932, he was defeated in a landslide. Discredited when he left office and overshadowed by a dynamic successor, Hoover's reputation was in ruins. But he lived longer than any other former president and dedicated himself to intellectual pursuits and public service. When he died in 1964, at the age of 90, he was mourned not as a great president, but as a great American. (1933). Millions had reached rock bottom. Some felt the American system, capitalism, was tottering. Democracy itself was threatened. On March 4th, 1933, a frightened nation turned to Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
In his first act, Roosevelt closed every bank in the country, allowing time to restore confidence in America's financial system. Roosevelt reported directly to the American people. His famous fireside chats reached millions.
You people must have faith. You must not be stampeded by rumors or guesses. Let us unite in banishing fear. Together, we cannot fail.
In his first 100 days in office, a dizzying array of legislation was passed. Roosevelt called his program the New Deal. The New Deal enjoyed wide public support, and Roosevelt campaigned for re-election.
Come on and row, row, row with Roosevelt on the good ship USA.
While Americans concentrated on the home front, the news from overseas was troubling. The world was heading toward war. As Hitler's forces swept through Europe, Roosevelt offered the support of America's industrial might to the fight against fascism.
We have the men, the skill, the wealth, and above all, the will. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
At the Atlantic Conference, he showed his solidarity with Winston Churchill and Great Britain. Then, Pearl Harbor.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
America was at war. The war effort united the nation and finished what the New Deal had started. The Depression ended. There was full employment. The mold of a woman's role in society was smashed. Millions of women entered the workplace for the first time. The new model was Rosie the Riveter. Fighting never reached the American mainland, but 400,000 Americans lost their lives in Europe, the Pacific, Africa. By the time of the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the war was nearing an end. A new world order, dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union, was emerging. Roosevelt appeared tired, frail. 2 months later, he died at Warm Springs, Georgia, just weeks before Germany's surrender. Harry S. Truman, the man from Independence, Missouri, a man from the heartland. As he took office, the war in Europe was coming to an end. On May 8th, 1945, Germany surrendered, but the war in the Pacific was raging. America was in sole possession of the atomic bomb. Truman made an historic decision. He would use the bomb to end the fight against Japan.
We have used it in order to shorten the agony of war, in order to save the lives of thousands and thousands of young Americans.
152,000 people died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Tens of thousands would suffer agonizing effects of radiation. Japan surrendered. The war was over. Truman's Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe brought desperately needed help to millions of war victims. In Eastern Europe, the grip of communism was tightening. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine was introduced to protect free countries from the expansionist Soviet Union. It was to be the basis of American foreign policy for the next 40 years. The year was 1949, and there was a Cold War. Two superpowers, the U.S. and the USSR, squared off. Capitalism versus communism. When South Korea was invaded by communist North Korea, Truman intervened. The year was 1950. He drew a line against communist expansion. The Korean War would last 3 painful years. 54,000 Americans died.
I shall not be a candidate.
In 1952, Truman decided not to be a candidate for re-election.
When Franklin Roosevelt died, I felt there must be 1 million men better qualified than I to take up the presidential task. But the work was mine to do, and I had to do it, and I've tried to give it everything that is in me.
I, Dwight D. Eisenhower, do solemnly swear.
In the first televised inauguration, Dwight
My
David
friend,
Eisenhower became president.
Before I...
He was the great hero of World War II, and his popularity carried him to the White House. The Eisenhower years were a time of tranquility, of prosperity. It was the 50s. The automobile was king, and Americans were heading for the suburbs.
No one is more aware than I that it is the young who fight the war. And it is the young who give up years of their lives to military training and service. It is not enough that their elders promised peace in our time. It must be peace in their time, too, and in their children's time.
He called for a halt to the arms race.
In a nuclear war, there can be no victors, only losers.
While simultaneously undertaking a massive buildup of nuclear missiles. Peace through strength, he believed. Ike increased covert operations throughout the world. The Eisenhower Doctrine asserted America's right to use force to defend any country threatened by international communism. The 50s brought new music, funny fads, good times, and America had a highly popular father figure as president. Everybody liked Ike. At 42, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was the youngest man ever elected president, the first president born in the 20th century. His good looks, his large active family, his very youthfulness seemed to invigorate the nation. They called it Camelot. Kennedy enjoyed great personal popularity and inspired a new generation to public service.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Early in his term, Kennedy ordered an invasion of Cuba by anti-Castro exiles. The battle at the Bay of Pigs was a fiasco and a bitter initiation for the young president. In October 1962, when Kennedy learned that Soviet nuclear missiles had been installed in Cuba, he ordered a naval blockade of the island. For a tense week, nuclear war, seemed possible. Then Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev ordered the removal of all missiles. In his 1,000 days in office, many felt Kennedy had grown as president, as a leader. Until November 22nd, 1963.
Something has happened here. We understand there has been a shooting. The presidential car coming up now. We know it's the presidential car. You can see Mrs. Kennedy's pink suit. There's a Secret Service man, spread eagle over the top of the car.
The President of the United States is dead. President Kennedy has been assassinated. It's official now. The President is dead.
President Kennedy was so contemporary a man, so involved in our world, so immersed in our times, so responsive to its challenges, that he seemed the very symbol of the vitality and the exuberance that is the essence of life itself.
This was America's introduction to Lyndon Baines Johnson as President of the United States.
I ask for your help and God's.
An earthy Texan, he could not have been more different from the urbane John Kennedy. Where Kennedy spoke of a vision for tomorrow, Johnson, with unparalleled skill and energy, created programs for today.
A great society where no man or woman are the victim of fear or poverty or hatred.
Johnson's domestic programs were his pride and joy, but the war in Vietnam would become his obsession. He was determined not to lose Vietnam to the communists. The war aroused great passions. Anti-war demonstrations swept across the country. And tumultuous cultural upheaval was reshaping America. The veneer of stability in American society was being torn apart. Cities exploded in violence. A commission appointed by President Johnson warned America is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate but unequal. But in the end, it was Vietnam that destroyed the Johnson presidency. Day after day, television brought the brutal images of war into American living rooms.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Johnson's great hopes for the nation seemed a distant memory, but the legacy of his great society remained. Out of the turmoil of 1968 and out of the ashes of his own political career emerged Richard Milhous Nixon. In 1960, Nixon lost the election to John Kennedy. 2 years later, he lost in a bid to be governor of California. Nixon, remarkably, 6 years later, he became the Republican nominee for president and went on to defeat Hubert Humphrey to become the 37th president of the United States. The expansion of the war into Cambodia fueled more protests. At Kent State University, 4 demonstrators were shot dead. The divisions over Vietnam would last for years. In foreign affairs, Nixon, the anti-communist crusader, opened relations with communist China and achieved détente with the Soviet Union, signing an agreement to limit nuclear arms. Nixon was re-elected in 1972 by an overwhelming margin. But as an aide would later say, a cancer was growing on the presidency. During the campaign, members of Nixon's re-election team burglarized Democratic headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington. Top government officials were implicated, but Nixon denied any knowledge. Eventually, it was learned that he had lied to the American people, and impeachment proceedings were begun. Nixon, never a quitter, faced a grim political reality.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
He became the only president to resign from office.
Only if you've been in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to be on the highest mountain.
Gerald Ford was a Boy Scout, a football star, a veteran, a solid citizen, and a loyal Republican. When evidence was uncovered that Nixon's Vice President Spiro Agnew had accepted bribes, Agnew resigned, and Gerald Ford was appointed Vice President.
I'm a Ford, not a Lincoln.
Within a year, Ford was president.
My fellow Americans, our long nightmare is over. Our Constitution works.
Just a month after becoming president, Ford pardoned former President Nixon. It was not a popular decision. In foreign affairs, the long American involvement in Vietnam finally ended. Communist North Vietnam conquered the South. In April 1975, Saigon fell. The American embassy was evacuated. President Ford and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, continued to expand both relations with China and détente with the Soviet Union. Ford lost in his bid to win the presidency on his own. Unable to overcome economic problems and lingering resentment over the Nixon pardon. During the campaign, America celebrated its 200th birthday. The bicentennial, like much of Ford's short time in office, was a time of national renewal, a time of healing, a time to move beyond the crippling legacies of Vietnam and Watergate.
Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully...
James Earl Carter from Plains, Georgia. As a political outsider, he had unique appeal. He seemed moral, sincere. One of his successes was bringing the leaders of Egypt and Israel together at Camp David. After 11 days, they agreed on a framework for peace. It was a great demonstration of leadership, a personal triumph for Jimmy Carter. Yet the peace accord was later overshadowed by problems in the Persian Gulf. The Shah of Iran, a longtime friend of the U.S., was overthrown by followers of Muslim fundamentalist Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. On November 4th, 1979, 52 Americans were taken hostage in Tehran.
They and all others must know that the United States of America will not yield to international terrorism or to blackmail.
For 444 days, Americans were preoccupied with the hostage crisis. At first, Carter was praised for his restraint. Over time, he appeared weak. Eventually, he initiated a raid to free the Americans. It was a fiasco. 8 men died. It seemed too little, too late. Carter left the White House in defeat, but his passion for human rights, his decency, and his continued work on behalf of the underprivileged around the world have earned him an honored place among former presidents. Ronald Wilson Reagan, the only actor to hold the world's most powerful office. He ran for president with a clear vision of America and of the American dream. He campaigned for lower taxes and smaller government.
It means taking hold of that government in Washington and squeezing the fat out of it and bringing it back down in size and power and taking the regulations and restrictions off the backs of industry and business in this country.
After a painful recession, the 1980s were marked by unprecedented economic growth and a soaring stock market. Reagan believed America carried the burden of freedom and democracy in the world. He supported military action in the Caribbean and Central America. Defense spending skyrocketed. He took a hard line against the Soviet Union.
They are the focus of evil in the modern world.
Later, Reagan became more flexible, negotiating arms reductions in a series of summits with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. The Iran-Contra scandal in 1986 was his greatest blunder. His administration secretly sold weapons to Iran. In exchange, they hoped for the release of American hostages. An eternal optimist, he handled illness and an assassination attempt with a sense of humor. Whatever history's final judgment on his presidency, Reagan left office in a glow of extraordinary popularity. Despite scandal and soaring deficits, American voters never blamed him personally. The 1988 campaign was hard-fought, at times bitter. Not since Martin Van Buren had an incumbent vice president been elected president.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
George Bush acknowledged his main interest was foreign affairs. He pursued personal diplomacy, engaging world leaders one-on-one, and was not reluctant to use force to achieve his goals. He ordered an invasion of Panama. Strongman Manuel Noriega was taken into custody. But his biggest decision was to use American forces in the Persian Gulf. Iraqi forces were expelled from Kuwait. Bush was riding a crest of popularity, and a new era was approaching. Eastern Europe was in rebellion, The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union crumbled. The old order was giving way to an uncertain future. The Cold War was over, but at home, the nation sank into a recession. The high-flying economy of the 80s had come to a halt. And once again, the seemingly intractable problem of race continued to tarnish the American landscape. In the spring of 1992, Los Angeles erupted in racial violence. More than 50 died. The nation groped for answers. Many Americans were losing faith in the country's political leaders. Some wondered whether the complexities of America's problems and the demands made on a president were too much for one man.
My fellow citizens, today we celebrate the mystery of American renewal. This ceremony is held in the depth of winter, but by the words we speak and the faces we show the world, we force the spring. A spring reborn in the world's oldest democracy that brings forth the vision and courage to reinvent America. Profound and powerful forces are shaking and remaking our world. And the urgent question of our time is whether we can make change our friend and not our enemy. Though our challenges are fearsome, so are our strengths. Americans have ever been a restless, questing, hopeful people. And we must bring to our task today the vision and will of those who came before us. But our greatest strength is the power of our ideas, which are still new in many lands. Across the world, we see them embraced and we rejoice. Our hopes, our hearts, our hands are with those on every continent who are building democracy and freedom. Their cause is America's cause. And so, my fellow Americans, as we stand at the edge of the 21st century, let us begin anew with energy and hope, with faith and discipline, and let us work until our work is done. The Scripture says, and let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. From this joyful mountaintop of celebration, we hear a call to service in the valley. We have heard the trumpets. We have changed the guard. And now, each in our own way, and with God's help, we must answer the call.
Today, the President of the United States is the most powerful elected official in the world. Herbert Hoover said the presidency must be a symbol of American ideals. Some presidents have met this standard. Many have not. Others still have betrayed it. But they all have been a link in the long chain of the country's destiny, past and future. Those we remember best have faced extraordinary challenges and have met them with grace and skill and courage. And in the process, the office itself has grown and has been redefined. Today, it is more important than ever to understand the presidency. For in a nuclear age, it is an office that holds in its hands survival itself.